The autumn wind carried the scent of smoke and desperation across the Montana plains as Jake Morrison urged his horse through the narrow canyon pass. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, chasing rumors of a lost family somewhere in these remote foothills. The local sheriff had mentioned it in passing, a young woman and her infant who'd headed into the wilderness weeks ago and never returned. Most folks had given up hope, but Jake wasn't most folks. His weathered hands gripped the reins as his mare picked her way carefully down the rocky slope. At 52, Jake had spent more years in the saddle than most men spent breathing, and his instincts had kept him alive through Indian raids, cattle rustlers, and winters that could freeze a man solid. Those same instincts were telling him something was wrong in these hills. The smoke he'd been following for the past hour was too thin to be a campfire, too persistent to be lightning-struck timber. It rose in a lazy spiral from somewhere beyond the next ridge, and with each step closer, Jake's unease grew. His horse snorted and shied as they crested the hill, her ears flat against her skull. That's when he saw it. What had once been a small log cabin now lay partially buried under a massive pile of rocks and timber. The entire eastern face of the cliff above had given way, probably during the fierce storms they'd had 2 weeks back. The structure was completely flattened on one side, with only a corner of the roof visible under tons of debris. Smoke drifted up from where a chimney used to be, suggesting a fire still smoldered somewhere beneath the wreckage. Jake dismounted and approached slowly, his boots crunching on scattered stones. The devastation was complete. No one could have survived this kind of collapse. He was about to turn away when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it over the wind. A baby's cry. Every muscle in Jake's body went rigid. He stood perfectly still, straining his ears, and there it was again, weak, desperate, but unmistakably human. Somewhere under that mountain of debris, someone was alive. "Hello," he shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Can you hear me?" The crying stopped. Then, barely audible through tons of rock and timber, came a woman's voice. "Help, please, help us." Jake didn't hesitate. He stripped off his coat and began pulling at the nearest rocks with his bare hands, his mind racing. The voice had come from somewhere near what looked like it might have been the cabin's main room. If they were trapped in a pocket of air, he might be able to reach them, but time was running short. The smoke meant something was still burning down there, and if the fire spread or if the remaining structure shifted, they'd all be dead. The first rocks came away easily, loose stones that had settled on top of the pile. But beneath them lay heavier timber, massive logs that had formed the cabin's walls, now twisted and wedged together like a giant's game of pick-up sticks. Jake grabbed the largest beam he could manage and heaved with all his strength. It barely budged. He tried a different approach, working to clear smaller pieces first, creating a path down into the wreckage. His hands were already bleeding from the rough stone, but he ignored the pain. Somewhere below, a woman and baby were running out of time. "I'm coming," he called out. "Stay strong." "The baby," came the faint reply. "She's hurt. I can't." The smoke. Jake worked faster, his movements becoming more frenzied. He wedged his shoulder under a fallen rafter and pushed until his face went red with effort. It shifted slightly, just enough to let him pull out another armload of debris. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool air, and his shirt was soon soaked through. As he dug deeper, the smoke grew thicker. Whatever was burning below was getting worse, not better. He could see orange light flickering somewhere in the depths of the wreckage, and the heat was beginning to make the air shimmer. If he was going to reach them, it had to be now. A large stone, probably weighing close to 200 pounds, blocked his path completely. Jake studied it from every angle, looking for leverage. There was no way around it. This rock was the key to reaching the trapped family. He positioned himself carefully, planted his feet, and wrapped his arms around the boulder. His back screamed in protest as he lifted, his face contorting with the effort. The stone moved an inch. Then another. Jake's vision began to blur from the strain, but he kept lifting, kept pushing, until finally the boulder rolled aside with a grinding crash. The opening it revealed was barely large enough for a man to squeeze through, but it was enough. Jake grabbed his rifle from where he dropped it and used the barrel to probe the opening. It seemed stable, though he could hear ominous creaking from the remaining timbers above. He called down into the hole, "I'm coming down to you." "Are you hurt badly?" "My leg," came the weak response. It's pinned. The baby. I don't think she's breathing right. Jake squeezed himself through the opening, lowering himself carefully into what had once been the cabin's main room. The scene that greeted him was heartbreaking. A young woman, probably no more than 20, lay trapped under a fallen beam. Her leg was clearly broken, bent at an unnatural angle, and her face was pale with shock and blood loss. Beside her, wrapped in what looked like the remains of a quilt, was an infant who couldn't have been more than 6 months old. The baby's breathing was shallow and labored, her tiny face smudged with soot. The woman had been using her own body to shield the child from falling debris, and both were covered in cuts and bruises. But they were alive, and that was all that mattered now. "Ma'am, I'm Jake Morrison," he said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "I'm going to get you both out of here." "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Collins. This is Emma, my husband. He went for supplies 2 weeks ago." Jake knelt beside them, quickly assessing their injuries. Sarah's leg was definitely broken, possibly in multiple places, and she'd lost a considerable amount of blood. The baby seemed to be suffering from smoke inhalation, but her color was better than her mother's. The immediate problem was the fire, which he could now see was consuming what remained of the cabin's eastern wall. They had maybe 10 minutes before the whole structure came down. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me," Jake said firmly. "I'm going to have to move this beam to free your leg. It's going to hurt something terrible, but I can't carry both you and the baby unless you can help me." She nodded weakly, clutching her daughter closer. "Do it." Jake positioned himself beside the heavy timber that had pinned Sarah's leg. It was easily 3 feet in circumference and probably weighed more than both of them combined. Under normal circumstances, it would take several men to move it safely. But these weren't normal circumstances. He braced his back against a partially collapsed wall and put both hands under the beam. Taking a deep breath, he lifted with every ounce of strength he possessed. His muscles strained, his bones creaked, and for a moment nothing happened. Then, slowly, the timber began to rise. "Pull your leg out," he grunted through clenched teeth. Sarah screamed as she dragged her broken leg free, but she managed it. Jake held the beam for another few seconds to make sure she was clear, then let it drop. With a thunderous crash, the impact sent vibrations through the entire structure, and more debris rained down from above. "We have to go now," Jake said, scooping up the baby with one arm while helping Sarah to her feet with the other. "Put your weight on me." They made their way slowly toward the opening Jake had created, Sarah hopping on one foot while leaning heavily against him. The fire was spreading faster now, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Smoke filled their lungs, making each breath a struggle. Reaching the opening, Jake faced his biggest challenge yet. He had to get both of them up through the hole and out of the wreckage, but Sarah couldn't climb with her broken leg, and he couldn't carry both her and the baby at the same time. "Sarah, I'm going to lift the baby up first," he said. "Then I'll come back for you." "No," she gasped. "Don't leave us." "I'm not leaving anybody," Jake said firmly. "Trust me." He handed Emma up through the opening first, placing her gently on a flat section of debris where she'd be safe. The baby was barely conscious but still breathing. Then he turned back to Sarah. "Put your arms around my neck," he instructed. "I'm going to carry you up, but you have to help by holding on tight." Sarah wrapped her arms around Jake's shoulders, and he began the agonizing climb up through the opening. Her dead weight made every movement a struggle, and loose rocks kept shifting under his feet. Halfway up, his grip slipped and they both nearly fell back into the flames below. But Jake gritted his teeth and kept climbing, driven by sheer determination and the knowledge that failure meant death for all of them. Finally, they reached the surface. Jake collapsed beside the opening, his chest heaving with exhaustion. His hands were raw and bleeding, his shirt was torn to shreds, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest. But they had made it. He gathered up baby Emma and helped Sarah move away from the wreckage just as the remaining structure gave way completely. The fire, no longer contained, roared up through the debris like a chimney, sending sparks and burning embers high into the sky. Within minutes, nothing remained of the Collins cabin but a pile of smoking rubble. Jake wrapped Sarah and the baby in his coat and helped them over to where his horse waited patiently. Sarah was going into shock from blood loss and pain, and the baby needed medical attention immediately. The nearest town was Millerville, A hard day's ride under the best of circumstances. With 2 injured passengers, it would take even longer. But as Jake lifted Sarah onto his horse and settled the baby in her arms, he felt a deep satisfaction that no amount of gold or cattle could provide. He'd heard that voice calling for help, and he'd answered. In a harsh land where people often died alone and forgotten, he'd made sure that wouldn't happen to Sarah Collins and her daughter. The ride to Millerville was long and difficult, but Jake never faltered. He walked beside his horse, one hand on the reins and one steadying his passengers, talking quietly to keep them conscious and calm. He told them about the ranch he'd worked for 30 years, about the storms he'd weathered and the mountains he'd crossed. He spoke of hope and perseverance, of the strength that comes from refusing to give up even when everything seems lost. By the time they reached town, both mother and child were stable enough to be turned over to the local doctor. Sarah's leg would heal, though she'd always walk with a slight limp. Baby Emma would grow up healthy and strong, with no memory of the day she was buried alive. Jake Morrison never spoke much about what happened that day in the canyon. When people asked, he'd just shrug and say he'd done what anyone would do. But those who knew him understood that wasn't quite true. Not everyone would have kept digging when the task seemed impossible. Not everyone would have risked their own life for strangers. Not everyone had hands strong enough to move mountains, or a heart big enough to refuse to give up on people he'd never met. In a land where survival often meant looking out for yourself first, Jake Morrison had proven that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from what you can take, but from what you're willing to give.